Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something that I like to do myself and something I like to do with my clients periodically is to rotate what sort of squat that we do. And you guys will notice throughout this video, these were all done in the same month of me doing basically some Olympic style squatting like you saw right there, right? You know, with sleeves and everything, of course, on squat shoes. And you'll see me doing, again, speed squats with a narrow Olympic type stance. And then I'm doing some wider stance squatting, right? We do some wide stance squatting, which is a power squat. And then, of course, you'll see me doing some ultra wide box squats for speed work, along with doing some of the speed work like this, you know, things with the safety bar done Olympic style against bands. And, you know, it kind of raises the question of what is it that we are getting out of these things? What are going to be the benefits to it? And a lot of it has to do with knee angle and the amount of hip involved. And here's the thing. When it comes to training these different things, I do believe that over time, it is very beneficial for us to train different stances and different grips. I believe, as you guys know from previous videos, it reduces overuse. Right? And people can argue about specificity of training all they want, you know, but again, how many of these guys do you see who are beat up? Right? I know guys who had big numbers when they were 30. Okay? And start looking at some of the YouTubers and stuff you've seen out there who've done heavy training and powerlifting, and they can't really lift heavy anymore long before they're my age. Okay? People who do high frequency, high specificity just ingrain that one movement over and over. They're all beat the hell up. Right. So from an overuse perspective, when we start messing with these, it's the same thing that we get with the sumo versus the deadlift. It's like how much of your hips is being hit with a load, right? Can your hips handle it? If we do lots of sumo pulling, our hips get eventually fatigued. If we do a lot of conventional pulling, our lower back gets fatigued, right? So how do we deal with that? What do we do about it? Well, we can rotate those stances. Well, it's the same thing on our squat, right? We can rotate between Olympic style squatting and we can rotate with wide power squatting. So the question starts to become, you know, what's the advantages of each? Well, for some people, it's going to be a depth thing. I personally can hit depth easier with a real wide stance. Okay, I have to be, when I go in close, I have to be very, very careful trying to hit depth, right? Because I'll just kind of bottom out my hips, and I may not always hit depth unless I get my toe angles just perfect. But I think that could be true with wider also, all right? It could be true with wider also. But in my case, I need toes forward. And I think I may have worked in some GMs in there too in this. Yeah, I did. But that's okay. We're just throwing footage in. So when I go wide, I have to have toes out in order to hit depth. And I can usually get deeper with a wider stance, per me personally. Some people, it's the opposite, right? But when we set the depth aside, what is it we're looking at? Well, we're going to look at what muscles are involved and then what joints get involved. All right, as far as getting inflammation towards the knee, the patellar tendons, things like that, you're going to see more of that with the Olympic style squat, right? And I don't define Olympic style versus power. I don't use bar placement. I really hate the whole high bar versus low bar because that has nothing to do with what's going on with your lower body. To me, I'm looking at your stance, right? And whether you choose a high bar or low bar, those is your own business. They're very independent of each other. But that aside, when we go with a real narrow stance, we get more flexion of the knee. Okay? Now, stance width does not matter for quad activation when knee angle is kept the same. The amount of flexion of the knee is the same. It doesn't seem to affect quad recruitment at all. However, when we go narrow, we generally do see, particularly like right at parallel, for example, you're going to see more flexion of the knee. All right, therefore you're going to work more quadricep in a lengthened position. all right, it is going to build more quad if your knee gets deeper. And that's the big if. Okay. However, the downside to that, it does put more inflammation on the knee, puts more inflammation on the patellar tendon. I personally, that area gets a little inflamed for me with too much narrow stance squatting. Me personally. Just the tendon, the patellar tendon does. All right. When we go over to a wide stance, what happens? Well, we might not work quite as much quad, unless the knee angle gets the same and unless weights just get really heavy as we get stronger at it. But what do we work in contrast? We work more total muscles. Okay, we work more adductor, more glute, more just hip extension in general, right? Those things get worked more with a wider stance. Also, again, more adductor because of the groin being stretched more. Think in terms of those lengthened positions, right? Think in terms of that lengthened position with a wider stance. Now, that being said, I don't want people to think that I'm saying that these squats are quad versus hip dominant, because the reality is all squats are hip dominant. Right? They're more hip extension dominant than they are quad. And when you look at the studies that have studied hypertrophy, the quads are only the muscle that grows a third fastest from even an Olympic style squat. Okay, power squats haven't been studied on these things, but Olympic squats have. And what they find is that the glutes and the adductors grow slightly faster than the quads do. So that tells us a lot about activation. Okay, it tells us a great deal about the activation. And it doesn't mean you can't build big quad squatting. Just understand that they may not be the dominant muscle that you think they are in regard to that. They're still a primary mover. Just like triceps on a bench press. Right? There's no way to take your triceps out of a bench press. Some bench presses hit triceps harder than others, but it's ultimately going to be a pec and front delt exercise any way you do a bench. Okay? From a hypertrophy and a stimulus perspective. Now, that being said, what happens? It can be a bit much on your hips. You can over time accrue some inflammation on the hips. Now, will the wider stance have more hypertrophic potential? Yes. Will you potentially build more muscle? Yes. Does it oftentimes have the potential to lift more weight as well? Yes. People who just have really massive quads might bridge that gap. So someone like me, during the times that I was doing this, I was actually hitting bigger weights, even with a narrower stance. But that's because I have such massive quads. It's a factor. Build the other muscles up and get used to the other style. You, in theory, should move more weight. It's more efficient. Okay, more muscles involved. Technically, slightly better leverages. So, when we start looking at the pros and cons, it has to do with basically how much quad versus how much hip extensor is being activated, and then which joints and tendons will be receiving inflammation. And when you understand these things from this perspective, it makes sense why there can be benefits and merits to rotating through them. Okay, it can relieve overuse. It can alleviate inflammation, and it should, in theory, it may have the potential to allow the building of more overall muscle mass due to the shift back and forth, just like, say, a closed grip versus a wide grip bench doing both. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.